Before the fear begins, hit like and subscribe, don't miss the chills. Tell us where you're watching from, and brace yourself for stories so terrifying, they'll haunt your night. The wind whispered across the barren desert, carrying with it grains of sand that scraped against the wooden planks of the old house. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of bruised purple and fiery orange, a prelude to the darkness that consumed the desert each night. The temperature had already begun to drop, the warmth of the day dissipating as the cold crept in, filling the air with an almost palpable chill. The house sat alone, its silhouette stark against the expanse of sand and scattered rocks. It was a modest structure, its once vivid paint now faded and peeling, a relic of a time when the land had promised prosperity. A single porch light flickered weakly, struggling against the encroaching darkness, casting elongated shadows that danced and twisted with the wind. The sound of the light bulb's faint buzzing was just audible beneath the howl of the wind, a small but persistent reminder of the house's tenuous connection to the modern world. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of aged wood and faintly musty upholstery. The living room was sparsely furnished, a threadbare couch, a low coffee table scarred with years of use, and a faded rug that barely covered the creaking floorboards. On the walls hung faded photographs, their sepia tones depicting a family, a mother, a father, 2 children. The youngest child's face was smeared slightly, as though someone had run a thumb across the image, leaving it blurred and ghostly. Near the window, the protagonist sat hunched over a sketchpad, the pencil in their hand moving in precise, deliberate strokes. They were a reclusive artist, drawn back to this remote desert home after years away. The years had not been kind to them. Their once bright eyes were now dulled with exhaustion, and their fingers bore the faint calluses of someone who had spent countless hours drawing, trying to capture something elusive. Tonight, they sketched the same image they had been working on for weeks, a figure standing in the desert, shrouded in shadows, its face indiscernible yet hauntingly familiar. This was their sibling, or at least, it was meant to be. They had been gone for years now, their disappearance a wound that had never healed. The desert had taken them, or so everyone had said. The locals spoke in hushed tones about skinwalkers, ancient entities that prowled the barren land, mimicking voices, faces, and movements. Never answer the knocking, the elders had warned. Never trust what calls to you in the night. But the protagonist had never believed in such things, at least, not until the knocking started. It had begun a week after they moved back into the house. At first, it was faint, a soft rapping on the door just before midnight. They had dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps an animal seeking shelter. But when they opened the door, there was nothing. No tracks in the sand, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. Each night, the knocking grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was outside knew they were ignoring it. Tonight, the knocking began earlier. The first sound came just as the last streak of sunlight disappeared from the sky. 3 sharp knocks, evenly spaced, like the ticking of a clock. The protagonist froze, their pencil pausing mid-stroke. For a moment, the house was silent except for the faint rustle of wind outside. Then it came again. 3 knocks, louder this time, reverberating through the stillness. They set the sketchpad down carefully, their movements slow and deliberate. The knocking had become a ritual, and though they had grown used to it, it still sent a shiver down their spine. They approached the door, their footsteps muffled by the rug, and peered through the peephole. As always, there was nothing but darkness outside. Still, they hesitated. The warnings from their childhood rang in their ears. Never answer the knocking. They clenched their jaw and backed away from the door. Instead of opening it, they turned to the window. Pulling the curtain aside, they scanned the yard. The faint light from the porch barely illuminated the immediate area, but it was enough to reveal a solitary figure in the distance. It stood at the edge of the property, just beyond the range of the light. The figure didn't move, its silhouette stark against the shadows of the desert. Their heart raced as they squinted, trying to make out its features. It looked human, almost. The knocking came again, louder and more forceful, as though whatever was outside was demanding entry. The protagonist tore their gaze away from the figure and backed away from the window. Their pulse thundered in their ears as they reached for their phone, but the screen remained dark. No service, just like every other night. The isolation of the desert, which had once seemed like a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. They tried to distract themselves, returning to their sketchpad and forcing their hand to move. The pencil scratched against the paper, but their focus was fractured. Each knock, 3 precise beats, sent a jolt through their body. They glanced at the clock on the wall. Midnight was approaching, and the knocking hadn't stopped. Suddenly, a new sound joined the knocking. It was faint at first, barely discernible over the wind. A voice. It called their name, soft and plaintive, like a whisper carried on the breeze. Their blood ran cold. The voice was achingly familiar, tinged with a tone they hadn't heard in years. "Help me," it said. The protagonist's chest tightened. It sounded like their sibling, the same inflection, the same cadence. But it couldn't be. They had searched for years, scoured the desert, and found nothing. The sibling was gone, lost to the sands or something worse. "This isn't real," they murmured to themselves. But the voice came again, louder this time, more desperate. "Please, help me. I'm so cold." They clenched their fists, their nails digging into their palms. The warnings echoed louder in their mind. Never trust what calls to you in the night. But what if it really was their sibling? What if they were alive, trapped, and waiting for rescue? The knocking ceased abruptly, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. The voice, too, was gone. The protagonist stood frozen, their breath shallow, their mind racing. For a moment, they thought it was over. But then, from beneath the floorboards, they heard it, a faint scratching, like nails dragging against wood. Their knees threatened to buckle as they stared at the floor. The sound grew louder, more frantic, as though something was trying to claw its way up. Their gaze darted to the rug, and they swore they saw it shift, as though something was pressing against it from below. Grabbing a flashlight from the nearby table, they knelt and pulled the rug aside. The old wooden boards were warped and uneven, but one in particular seemed loose. With trembling hands, they pried it up, revealing a narrow space beneath the floor. The beam of the flashlight illuminated a small, hollow cavity. At first, it seemed empty. Then they saw it. A small figurine lay in the dust, its surface rough and weathered. It was carved in the shape of a human, its features crude but unmistakable. Its eyes were small indentations, and its mouth was a jagged line that curved upward in a grotesque smile. The protagonist recoiled, dropping the flashlight. The figurine seemed to pulse with an energy that made their skin crawl. The scratching stopped. The house was silent again, but the silence felt heavier, oppressive. The protagonist picked up the flashlight, their hands slick with sweat, and stared at the figurine. It was familiar, disturbingly so. They realized with a sickening jolt that it bore a resemblance to their sibling. A sudden knock shattered the silence, louder and more forceful than before. The protagonist's head snapped up, their breath catching in their throat. The sound was no longer coming from the door. It was coming from the window. They turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in their grasp. The curtains billowed slightly, the fabric brushing against the glass as though something outside was pushing against it. They stepped closer, their heart pounding, and reached for the curtain. With a swift motion, they pulled it aside. The figure was there, standing just outside the window. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its outline was unmistakable. It raised a hand and knocked on the glass, 3 deliberate taps that echoed in the stillness. The protagonist stumbled back, the flashlight beam jerking wildly. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. And then, as they stared, it tilted its head, its movements unnervingly slow. The gesture was almost questioning, as though it was waiting for something. The voice came again, soft but insistent. "Help me. Let me in." The figure at the window didn't move. Its presence seemed to anchor the air in a stifling heaviness, each breath the protagonist took feeling more labored than the last. The dim beam of the flashlight wavered across the glass, catching glimpses of something, a hand, perhaps? But the longer they stared, the harder it became to discern features. The edges of the figure blurred like heat waves on the horizon, shifting in and out of focus. And then it was gone. The protagonist blinked, stepping closer to the window, their breath fogging the glass. They swept the flashlight over the yard, scanning the dunes and jagged rocks beyond the porch. The figure had vanished without a sound, as though it had never been there. But the unease clung to the room, a palpable residue of something wrong. They let the curtain fall back into place and turned toward the figurine still lying in the hollow beneath the floor. Picking it up felt like a violation, as though they were disturbing something that was meant to stay buried. The carved face stared up at them with its crude smile, an eerie mimicry of joy that set their teeth on edge. Holding it sent a faint tremor up their arm, like static electricity buzzing beneath the skin. The scratching began again, soft at first, then sharper and more insistent. But this time, it wasn't coming from the floorboards. It was coming from the walls. The protagonist froze, listening as the sound traveled along the perimeter of the room. It circled them, stopping just long enough in one spot to make their skin crawl before moving again. The house creaked, the old wood groaning as though something heavy was pressing against it. Clutching the figurine tightly, they backed into the center of the room, their gaze darting between the walls. Then came the voice. "You can't ignore me forever," it said, low and guttural, with an edge that scraped against their nerves like nails on a chalkboard. It wasn't their sibling's voice anymore. It was something else entirely, something that spoke through layers, as though 1,000 voices were layered atop each other, vying for dominance. "What do you want?" the protagonist whispered, their voice trembling. They weren't sure if they expected an answer, or if they even wanted one. But the voice didn't reply. Instead, the scratching stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against their eardrums. A sudden crash shattered the stillness. They whipped around to see the bookshelf topple over, its contents spilling across the floor in a cacophony of thuds and cracks. Books lay splayed open, their pages torn, while a single framed photograph lay face down among the mess. Slowly, they reached down and picked it up, brushing off shards of glass. The photograph was of their sibling. It was taken years ago, back when the desert had still seemed vast and full of possibilities. Their sibling stood smiling, arms raised in mock triumph against the backdrop of endless dunes. But as the protagonist stared, the smile in the photo seemed to twist, the once joyful expression warping into something sinister. They dropped the frame, letting it shatter fully on the floor. Their heart raced as a realization crept over them. They weren't alone in the house. They could feel it now, the unmistakable weight of a presence lingering just out of sight. The air felt heavier, colder, as though the walls themselves were closing in. A knock echoed through the room, not from the door or the window this time, but from the ceiling. 3 deliberate taps, slow and methodical, reverberated through the plaster. The protagonist tilted their head upward, their body frozen as they strained to listen. Another knock followed, and then another, each one louder than the last. They grabbed the flashlight and made their way cautiously toward the attic hatch. The pull string dangled like a noose, swaying slightly even though there was no draft. Their hands trembled as they reached up and yanked it. The ladder descended with a groan, each rung creaking as it unfolded. "You don't have to do this," they muttered to themselves, but the words felt hollow. They couldn't shake the pull of the mystery, the feeling that whatever was happening was connected to their sibling's disappearance. The flashlight beam wavered as they climbed, illuminating the narrow crawl space of the attic. The air up there was stale, thick with the smell of dust and old wood. The flashlight swept across the space, revealing a collection of forgotten relics, boxes of faded holiday decorations, a broken rocking chair, a stack of yellowed newspapers. But in the far corner, something caught their eye. A small pile of objects sat arranged in a deliberate circle. There were bones, small and brittle, alongside dried herbs and blackened feathers. At the center of the circle was another figurine, identical to the one they held in their hand. It was positioned upright, as though it had been watching the room. Their pulse thundered in their ears as they approached. The air seemed to hum with an almost imperceptible vibration, a frequency that set their teeth on edge. They knelt by the circle, examining the objects without touching them. The arrangement felt purposeful, ritualistic, as though someone had left it there as an offering or a warning. A sudden noise behind them made them whip around. The attic hatch had slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. The flashlight flickered, its weak beam casting erratic shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Panic clawed at their chest as they scrambled back toward the ladder, their foot catching on something that sent them sprawling to the floor. As they scrambled to their feet, the voice returned. This time, it came from all around them, echoing in the confined space. "You're getting closer," it said, the words dripping with malice. "But are you sure you want to know?" The protagonist gritted their teeth, their fear giving way to a surge of defiance. "What did you do to them?" they shouted into the darkness. The voice chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down their spine. "They're not gone," it said. "Not entirely." The flashlight flickered again before cutting out completely, leaving the protagonist in total darkness. They fumbled for their phone, using the screen's dim glow to find the ladder. As they descended, the voice followed them, its words growing more fragmented and cryptic. "You think this is about answers," it hissed. "But some truths aren't meant to be found." When they reached the living room, the air felt different. It was warmer, almost stifling, and the shadows cast by the dim light stretched unnaturally long across the floor. The figurine they had dropped earlier was no longer where they had left it. Instead, it sat upright on the coffee table, facing them. A sudden pounding on the front door made them jump. It wasn't the same deliberate knocking as before. This was frantic, desperate, as though someone was trying to break the door down. They hesitated, their instincts warring with their curiosity. Slowly, they approached the door and peered through the peephole. On the other side was their sibling. They gasped, stumbling back from the door. It couldn't be. They had searched for so long, mourned for so long. But there they were, standing on the porch, their face pale and gaunt but unmistakably theirs. "Please," the sibling said, their voice muffled through the door. "Please let me in. It's so cold out here." The protagonist's hands shook as they reached for the doorknob. But then the warnings came flooding back. Never answer the knocking. Never trust what calls to you in the night. They hesitated, their fingers hovering just inches from the cold metal. "How do I know it's you?" they asked, their voice barely above a whisper. The siblings' expression shifted, their eyes narrowing slightly. "What kind of question is that?" they said, their tone sharp. "It's me. Just let me in." But something in their voice was off. The cadence was right, but the warmth, the emotion, it wasn't there. It was hollow, like an actor reciting lines they didn't believe. "Say something only you would know," the protagonist demanded. The sibling hesitated, their expression unreadable. Then they smiled, but it was the wrong kind of smile, too wide, too forced. "You always were the paranoid one," they said. The protagonist's blood ran cold. That was something their sibling would say, yes, but the way they said it, it felt rehearsed. Calculated. Before they could react, the pounding stopped. The porch was silent once more. The protagonist opened the door a crack, the weak porch light illuminating an empty expanse of sand. Their sibling was gone. But as they stared out into the night, they saw something in the distance, the figure from before, standing motionless at the edge of the property. This time, it raised a hand and waved. The figure waved, its movements slow and deliberate, as if mocking the protagonist's inability to act. A wave of nausea washed over them as the air seemed to thicken, pressing against their chest. They slammed the door shut, leaning their full weight against it, but the gesture felt futile. The presence beyond the walls was no longer content to linger at the edges, it was closing in. The house groaned under the strain of silence, each creak and pop of the old wood amplified in the oppressive stillness. The protagonist's pulse hammered in their ears as they backed away from the door, their mind racing. The figurine on the coffee table sat motionless, its crude smile seeming to widen in the flickering candlelight. They grabbed it instinctively, their grip tightening around the rough wood. "What do you want from me?" they shouted, their voice cracking. The words echoed through the empty house, swallowed by the void. There was no reply, only the faint, distant sound of the desert wind. Then the knocking resumed. It was no longer a polite, rhythmic tap. It was frantic, chaotic, as though multiple fists were pounding against the walls from every direction. The windows rattled in their frames, and the floor beneath their feet vibrated with the force of the blows. The protagonist stumbled, clutching the figurine to their chest like a talisman. "Stop it," they screamed, but the pounding only grew louder, more insistent. The noise was deafening, an unrelenting cacophony that seemed to come from the very bones of the house. They fell to their knees, covering their ears, but it was no use. The sound was inside them now, reverberating in their skull. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. It pressed down on them like a physical weight, the absence of sound ringing in their ears. They opened their eyes slowly, their vision swimming as they tried to steady their breathing. The room was unchanged, but something felt different. The air was heavier, charged with an unseen energy that prickled at their skin. A voice broke the silence, low and guttural, emanating from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You've taken what isn't yours," it said. The words crawled along their spine like ice. "You should have left it buried." The protagonist clutched the figurine tighter, their knuckles white. "What is this?" they demanded, their voice trembling. "What did you do to my sibling?" The voice chuckled, a hollow, mirthless sound. "They sought answers," it said. "Just as you do now. But some truths come at a cost." The lights flickered, plunging the room into brief pockets of darkness. When the light returned, the figure from the window was inside, standing in the corner of the room. Its features were indistinct, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. But its eyes, black, fathomless voids, were fixed on the protagonist. "Leave," the protagonist said, their voice barely above a whisper. "Get out of my house." The figure tilted its head, its movements unnaturally fluid. "Your house," it repeated, the words dripping with derision. "This place belongs to us now." Before they could react, the figure surged forward, closing the distance in an instant. The protagonist scrambled backward, tripping over the overturned coffee table. The figurine slipped from their grasp, skittering across the floor. The figure loomed over them, its presence suffocating. "You've seen too much," it said. "But there is still a way out. A way to make this right." "What do you mean?" they asked, their voice shaking. The figure extended a hand, its fingers impossibly long and thin, ending in sharp points. "Give it back," it said. "Return what you took, and we may spare you." The protagonist's eyes darted to the figurine lying a few feet away. They reached for it, but the figure's hand shot out, pinning them to the floor. Its touch burned like ice, searing through their skin. "You don't understand," the figure hissed. "This is not a choice. This is a warning." The protagonist's vision blurred as pain radiated through their body. They gasped, their free hand fumbling for the figurine. Their fingers closed around it, and they swung it toward the figure with all their strength. The moment the wood made contact, the figure let out an ear-piercing scream, its form unraveling like smoke caught in a gust of wind. The pressure lifted, and the protagonist scrambled to their feet, clutching the figurine. The room was empty again, but the air still hummed with tension. They staggered toward the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to pulse, closing in around them. "You can't run," the voice said, echoing from the shadows. "You're part of this now." The protagonist's gaze darted around the room, searching for an escape. Their eyes landed on the attic hatch, still slightly ajar. They hesitated for only a moment before climbing the ladder, the figurine clutched tightly in one hand. The attic was dark and stifling, the air thick with the scent of decay. In the corner, the ritual circle they had found earlier was glowing faintly, the bones and feathers pulsing with an otherworldly light. The figurine in their hand seemed to resonate with the energy, growing warm to the touch. They stepped toward the circle, their movements slow and deliberate. "What is this?" they whispered, their voice barely audible. "A doorway," the voice replied. "But not one you can close." The glow intensified, the light searing into their retinas. They shielded their eyes, but the image burned into their mind, a vast, desolate landscape, where twisted figures writhed in the shadows of an eternal dusk. At the center of it all was a towering shape, its form indistinct but undeniably powerful. It turned toward them, and though it had no eyes, they felt its gaze pierce through them. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving them gasping for air. The circle was dark once more, the objects within it reduced to ash. But the figurine in their hand was glowing now, its carved smile seeming to shift and change. "You've opened the door," the voice said, its tone almost gleeful. "And now they're coming." The attic hatch slammed shut, trapping them inside. The walls shook, and the sound of knocking returned, louder and more frantic than ever. It was no longer confined to the house, it echoed from the desert beyond, a symphony of dread that reverberated through the very earth. The protagonist fell to their knees, clutching the figurine as tears streamed down their face. They had wanted answers, but now they realized the cost. The desert outside was alive with movement, shadows converging on the house from every direction. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it was all they could hear. And then, just as it reached a fever pitch, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. They opened their eyes, and for a moment, they thought they were alone. But then the voice spoke again, soft and close, as though it was whispering directly into their ear. "It's too late," it said. "They're already here." The air in the attic felt thicker than ever, clinging to the protagonist's skin like a suffocating shroud. They clutched the glowing figurine, its carved smile now resembling a grimace, as if mocking their terror. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was deceptive, brimming with an unnatural stillness that threatened to shatter at any moment. From the edges of the circle of ash, a faint whisper began, growing louder and weaving into a chant. It wasn't in any language the protagonist recognized, but the tone was insidious, each syllable scratching at their sanity. They backed away instinctively, but the attic seemed to warp, the walls curving inward as if to force them closer to the ritual site. The figurine in their hands pulsed with a rhythmic heat, syncing with the erratic beat of their heart. It felt alive, as though it had become a tether to the dark forces beyond the veil. They dropped it instinctively, but the moment it hit the floor, the attic erupted in light. The circle flared back to life, glowing with a furious red that painted the room in grotesque shadows. "What do you want from me?" the protagonist screamed, their voice cracking under the weight of their desperation. The shadows didn't respond with words. Instead, they began to take shape, coalescing into figures that towered over them. These forms were indistinct yet horrifyingly real, their jagged edges shifting like smoke but exuding a malice that was undeniable. At the center of the circle, a void began to form, a rippling darkness that seemed to devour the light around it. From this abyss emerged a presence that dwarfed the shadowy figures. Its shape was incomprehensible, a mass of shifting textures and impossible geometry that defied logic. Yet, despite its chaotic form, its intent was clear. It was here for the figurine and for the one who had dared to disturb its rest. The protagonist's mind reeled as memories of their sibling flashed before them. The desperate search, the unanswered questions, the figurine that had felt like a lifeline to understanding it all. Now, that lifeline had turned into a noose, tightening with each passing second. "Give it back," a voice boomed from the abyss, resonating through their very bones. It wasn't the same voice that had whispered earlier. This one was deeper, commanding, and filled with an authority that left no room for defiance. "I don't understand," they cried, their knees buckling under the weight of the entity's presence. "What is this? Why is this happening?" The entity's form shifted, a limb or something resembling a limb emerging and pointing directly at the protagonist. The figurine lifted off the floor, floating midair between them. The carvings on its surface began to glow brighter, patterns shifting and rearranging to form symbols that pulsed with ancient power. "It was never yours to take," the voice said. "It is a key, a beacon, a curse. You have opened the door, and now you must decide what passes through." The protagonist's hands shook as they reached for the figurine, but the closer they came, the more the air seemed to resist them. Invisible forces clawed at their skin, pulling them back, whispering temptations and threats into their ears. "What happens if I give it to you?" they asked, their voice barely audible. The entity didn't answer directly. Instead, images flooded their mind, barren landscapes littered with bones, a sky perpetually darkened by swirling clouds, figures like the shadows in the attic roaming freely, devouring everything in their path. And then, a final image, their sibling, standing at the edge of a cliff, looking back with hollow eyes before stepping into the void. "And if I don't?" they asked, tears streaming down their face. The images shifted to show the house collapsing in on itself, the desert outside consumed by a wave of darkness that spread endlessly, devouring towns, cities, and lives. "There is no escape," the voice said. "There is only balance or destruction. Choose." The protagonist's mind raced. The figurine hung in the air, its glow pulsating like a heartbeat. They could feel the weight of the decision crushing them, the moral dilemma tearing at their soul. If they gave the figurine to the entity, would it truly stop the chaos? Or would it unleash something even worse? If they kept it, could they find a way to undo the damage, or would they doom everything they had ever known? A sudden noise broke their concentration. The attic hatch burst open, and the desert wind howled through the space. Standing in the opening was their sibling. But it wasn't the person they remembered. Their eyes were sunken, their skin pale and stretched tight over their bones. Yet there was a flicker of recognition, a spark of humanity buried beneath the corruption. "Don't do it," the sibling said, their voice strained and hoarse. "You can't trust it. You have to destroy it." "Destroy it," the protagonist repeated, glancing between their sibling and the entity. The figurine trembled in the air, as if caught between two opposing forces. The entity's form shifted violently, its edges growing sharper, more menacing. "They are lost," it said. "A fragment of what once was. Do not let their weakness be your ruin." The siblings stepped closer, their movements unsteady but determined. "Please," they said, reaching out a trembling hand. "You have to end this. Break the figurine. It's the only way to stop it." The protagonist's heart pounded as they stared at the figurine, their mind a whirlwind of fear and doubt. The weight of the decision pressed down on them, the room spinning as the conflicting voices of their sibling and the entity clashed in their head. Finally, with a scream of defiance, they reached out and grabbed the figurine. The moment their fingers closed around it, the attic exploded with light and sound. The entity roared, its form unraveling and expanding, filling the space with a chaotic energy that threatened to tear everything apart. The protagonist raised the figurine above their head, their hands trembling. They could feel its power coursing through them, a torrent of energy that burned and froze simultaneously. They locked eyes with their sibling, who nodded slowly, tears streaming down their face. "I'm sorry," the protagonist whispered, and with all their strength, they slammed the figurine against the floor. The impact sent a shockwave through the attic, shattering the circle and sending the entity's form spiraling into the void. The shadows screamed as they were pulled back into the darkness, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. The glow of the figurine faded, its carvings crumbling into dust. When the light finally dimmed, the protagonist found themselves alone in the attic. The air was still, the oppressive weight lifted. They collapsed to the floor, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and grief. The attic hatch creaked open, revealing the faint light of dawn. They crawled toward it, their limbs heavy, and descended the ladder. The house was eerily quiet, the chaos of the night reduced to a haunting memory. Outside, the desert stretched out before them, unchanged yet profoundly different. The sun rose over the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for them. They took a deep breath, the cool morning air filling their lungs, and turned back to look at the house. In the window, they saw their sibling's reflection, smiling faintly before fading away. The figurine was gone, its power extinguished, but the memory of its curse lingered. As the protagonist walked into the desert, they couldn't shake the feeling that the knocking wasn't entirely over. Somewhere, in the vast emptiness, it was waiting to begin again. The morning air was crisp, but it carried a strange weight, as if the desert itself mourned the events of the night. The protagonist stumbled out of the house, their legs weak, their body aching from the ordeal. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, but it felt wrong, too bright, too indifferent to the darkness they had faced. They turned back to look at the house, its weathered facade now a quiet shell. The attic window, where so much had transpired, seemed lifeless, the glass cracked and smeared with ash. The figurine was gone, reduced to dust, but its presence lingered like a phantom. They couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching, its silence more ominous than the knocking ever was. The desert stretched out endlessly before them, vast and empty, yet teeming with the echoes of what had transpired. Each step away from the house felt like a step into an uncertain future, the weight of their choices pressing down on them. Their sibling's face flashed in their mind, not the hollow-eyed figure from the attic, but the person they remembered, laughing, vibrant, alive. Was it really over? The protagonist made their way back to the truck, parked haphazardly near the edge of the property. Its frame was coated in a thin layer of dust, as if the desert had tried to claim it overnight. They slid into the driver's seat, their hands trembling as they gripped the steering wheel. The keys were still in the ignition, but for a moment, they hesitated, staring at their reflection in the rearview mirror. Their face was pale, their eyes sunken, and there was something else, a flicker of movement in the backseat. They whipped around, heart pounding, but the space was empty. Just a trick of the light, they told themselves. Just the lingering effects of a sleepless, harrowing night. The engine sputtered to life, breaking the oppressive silence. They pulled onto the dirt road, the tires kicking up clouds of dust as they drove away from the house. The further they went, the lighter they felt, as though the weight of the house's darkness was finally lifting. But the relief was short-lived. As they crested a hill, the radio crackled to life, a burst of static that sent shivers down their spine. They hadn't touched the dial. The static gave way to a faint voice, barely audible over the hum of the engine. It was distorted, fragmented, but they recognized it immediately. "You can't outrun it," the voice said. It was their sibling's voice. They slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. Their breath came in shallow gasps as they stared at the radio, which had gone silent again. The desert around them was empty, the only sound the wind rustling through the scrub. But the words echoed in their mind, chilling them to the core. The protagonist reached the nearest town by midday, a small, sun-baked cluster of buildings that seemed to barely cling to existence. They parked in front of a diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the sunlight, and stumbled inside. The air conditioning hit them like a wave, a stark contrast to the desert heat. The waitress behind the counter gave them a curious look as they sat down at a booth, their hands still shaking. "Rough morning?" she asked, pouring them a cup of coffee. "You could say that," they replied, their voice hoarse. The coffee was bitter, but it grounded them, pulling them out of their spiraling thoughts. They looked around the diner, taking in the mundane normalcy of it all. A couple arguing quietly in the corner, a trucker nursing a plate of eggs, a radio playing a soft country tune. It felt surreal, like stepping into another world. But even here, they couldn't escape the feeling that they were being watched. The reflection in the diner's window seemed to ripple, shadows shifting at the edges of their vision. They shook their head, trying to dismiss it as paranoia. "You okay?" the waitress asked, her voice cutting through their thoughts. "Yeah," they said, forcing a weak smile. "Just a long night." The waitress nodded, but her expression remained concerned. "Well, if you need anything, just holler." After leaving the diner, the protagonist wandered the streets of the small town, hoping to find some sense of normalcy. They stopped at a general store, picking up a few supplies, and exchanged polite conversation with the cashier. But everywhere they went, they felt it, a presence, subtle but undeniable, like eyes boring into the back of their skull. They decided to spend the night at a motel on the edge of town, a run-down place with peeling paint and flickering lights. The room smelled of mildew, and the bed creaked with every movement, but it was a refuge, however temporary. They locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the figurine-shaped void in their memories. Sleep came in fits and starts, haunted by vivid dreams of the house and the entity. In one dream, they stood in the attic again, the circle of ash glowing faintly at their feet. The shadows whispered to them, voices overlapping until they formed a single, coherent message: "It's not over." They woke with a start, the room dark and silent. The clock on the nightstand read 3:33 a.m. They sat up, rubbing their eyes, and froze when they heard it, a faint knocking at the motel door. Their blood ran cold as the knocking continued, slow and deliberate. They held their breath, their mind racing. Was it just a late-night traveler? A prank? Or was it something worse? "Who's there?" they called out, their voice trembling. The knocking stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. They approached the door cautiously, their heart pounding in their chest. Through the peephole, they saw nothing but darkness, an impenetrable void that seemed to press against the glass. They stepped back, their mind screaming at them to run, to leave everything behind. But where could they go? The entity's words echoed in their mind, "There is no escape." The knocking resumed, louder this time, more insistent. They grabbed a lamp from the nightstand, holding it like a weapon, and steeled themselves. With a deep breath, they flung the door open, ready to face whatever was on the other side. But the hallway was empty. The desert wind howled through the open door, carrying with it a faint whisper that sent chills down their spine. They stepped outside, the cold air biting at their skin, and looked around. The motel parking lot was deserted, the town silent. As they turned back toward the room, they noticed something on the ground, a small object, half buried in the dirt. They picked it up, their hands trembling. It was a shard of the figurine, its carvings faintly glowing in the moonlight. The next morning, the protagonist left the town, driving aimlessly through the desert. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, the shadows in their peripheral vision seeming to move with purpose. The shard of the figurine sat on the passenger seat, a grim reminder of the events that had unfolded. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the landscape, they pulled over to the side of the road. The desert stretched out before them, vast and indifferent, but they felt a strange pull, a sense of purpose. They stepped out of the truck, the shard clutched tightly in their hand, and began to walk. The wind whispered around them, carrying voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The sky darkened, the stars appearing one by one, and they felt the weight of the desert's vastness pressing down on them. Finally, they reached a small clearing, marked by a single, ancient tree. The air was still, the world holding its breath. They knelt at the base of the tree, the shard glowing faintly in their hand, and began to dig. As they buried the shard, the ground trembled, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The voices grew louder, overlapping into a deafening cacophony, and then silence. They sat back, their body trembling with exhaustion, and looked up at the sky. The stars seemed brighter, the air lighter. For the first time in what felt like forever, they felt a glimmer of hope. But as they stood and turned back toward the road, they saw it, a shadow, faint but unmistakable, watching from the edge of the clearing. It didn't move, didn't approach, but its presence was enough to send a chill down their spine. The knocking in the desert had stopped, but the shadows still lingered. Watching. Waiting. Story number 2. It was a calm, misty morning when Alex found themselves on the winding backroads of a forgotten forest, the kind of place you'd only stumble into if you weren't looking. A road trip, meant to be an escape, had taken Alex through one forgotten town after another, endless miles of roads that twisted and turned as if they were trying to hide something from view. The engine of their rusted sedan hummed along, the tires gripping the slick asphalt as it weaved through trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the fog. The air was thick and damp, the smell of wet earth and pine settling in Alex's chest. The world felt muted, as though the fog itself was smothering every sound, every whisper of life. Alex had been on the road for hours, unsure of the time, the surroundings, or even their own direction. It didn't matter. This trip wasn't about destinations, it was about escape. Escape from the same old routine, from the humdrum life of a city that never seemed to let up. But something about today felt different. A shift in the air that couldn't be explained, a sudden sense that the road itself was becoming unfamiliar. The radio had stopped working hours ago, and Alex had long given up trying to adjust the dial. The only sound now was the occasional creak of the car's suspension as it bounced over the uneven road. The mist hung so thickly in the air that it blurred the outlines of everything. Even the towering trees seemed like ghostly apparitions, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes, their leaves barely visible in the pale light of the morning. It was as if the forest had become an entirely different world, one that existed in a half-forgotten dream. A place untouched by time, where the ordinary rules of existence didn't apply. Alex glanced at the map in their lap, nothing but a series of curving lines and vague symbols that didn't seem to lead anywhere. Their original plan had been simple: drive across the country, take in the scenery, stop at some roadside attractions. It had started out fine, full of empty highways and picturesque landscapes. But now, the sense of unease had begun to creep in. The roads seemed to narrow, twist, and vanish into thin air. The trees became denser, their canopy blocking out most of the light. And then, there was the bridge. It appeared out of nowhere. One moment, Alex was driving down a forgotten stretch of road with the fog swallowing everything in sight, and the next, the fog parted just enough to reveal an old bridge. The wooden planks creaked under the weight of the air itself, the structure seeming ancient, like something forgotten by time. The kind of bridge you might see in old photos from the early 1900s, long abandoned, yet still standing in some decaying corner of the world. For a moment, Alex hesitated, unsure of whether to continue forward. The fog rolled in thicker, wrapping around the base of the bridge like a blanket. The towering trees on either side of the bridge seemed to bend inward, their branches swaying slightly in a wind that wasn't there. The world beyond the bridge was completely obscured by the thick, white mist. But what choice did Alex have? The road behind them was just as isolated and empty as the one ahead. It was either turn back into the unknown or cross this strange, abandoned bridge. Alex's hand gripped the wheel tighter, their fingers digging into the worn leather as they pushed the accelerator and moved forward. The tires crunched lightly over the gravel as the car came to a stop at the foot of the bridge. The wooden planks stretched out before them, a broken-down guardrail that had long lost its ability to keep anything in or out. The bridge didn't look like much. Old, sure. Weathered, definitely. But there was something about it that felt off, something Alex couldn't explain, something deep in their gut that urged them to turn around. But they couldn't. Something about the place felt oddly magnetic, as though the bridge itself was pulling them in, beckoning them to cross. The car's headlights swept over the bridge, illuminating the sagging wooden planks that stretched out into the fog. At first glance, it seemed solid enough. There were no obvious holes, no signs of rot, just the kind of slow decay you might expect from something that had been forgotten for decades. But even as Alex stepped out of the car and felt the cold mist press against their skin, they couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that seemed to settle into their chest. With a glance over their shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching, they pulled their backpack over their shoulder and stepped toward the bridge. The mist seemed to envelop them the moment they stepped onto the first plank. The air was thick, damp, and oddly still, pressing in on them with a suffocating weight. The only sound was the soft scuff of their boots against the wet wood as they walked forward. As they ventured further across, the trees lining the sides of the bridge began to recede, swallowed by the fog. The fog seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, encasing the bridge in a ghostly cocoon. Every step felt like stepping deeper into a place that shouldn't exist. The sound of their own breath felt loud against the oppressive silence, and with each step, Alex could feel the bridge's weight beneath them, its old timbers groaning in protest. But it was more than just the physical feeling of the bridge underfoot. It was the overwhelming sensation of being watched. As Alex walked further, they couldn't shake the creeping sense that something or someone was standing just outside the edges of the fog, watching them. They could feel eyes on the back of their neck, hear the faintest rustling sound in the mist, a sound that was just too quiet to be sure of. Every few steps, Alex turned, half expecting to see someone behind them. But each time, the space behind them was empty. The fog remained still. The trees remained motionless. Yet, the feeling of eyes watching them never faded. The further Alex went, the more oppressive the air became. The temperature dropped, and the fog seemed to thicken, swirling around their legs like a living thing. At times, the mist seemed to reach out, pulling them forward as if it had a will of its own. It didn't make sense. This wasn't a place that should exist, not in the world Alex knew. There was no sign of life here, no birds singing, no animals moving through the brush. Only the silence and the endless fog. The bridge itself felt strange, too. As Alex stepped onto the first set of planks, they noticed something odd. The wood felt slick underfoot, as though something was seeping up from within the timbers, something dark and wet, like decay or moss. The bridge seemed alive in a way that shouldn't be possible, as though it had a mind of its own, pulling them in, urging them to continue forward. With each step, the world around them seemed to fade further and further away. The road behind them, the car they'd left behind, it all seemed so distant now, as if they had stepped into another world. A world where nothing made sense. A world that seemed to hold nothing but endless mist, endless fog, and endless waiting. The eerie feeling of isolation became all-consuming. Alex's heart beat faster as they pushed forward, trying to shake the sense of dread that clung to them like a second skin. Something wasn't right, and deep down, they knew it. The bridge wasn't just a bridge, it was something far darker, far more insidious. And as Alex ventured further, stepping cautiously across the warped wooden planks, they realized something even more chilling. The fog didn't just obscure the world around them. It seemed to obscure their perception of reality itself. They could feel their thoughts slowing down, the disorientation creeping in. The fog made it impossible to see anything beyond a few feet, but somehow, they felt as if the world beyond the mist was still watching, waiting. And then it happened. The faintest sound, barely audible, like the whisper of a breath, slipped into their ears. The air seemed to shift, the temperature dropping even further. The faint, eerie whispers that danced just out of earshot sent a jolt through Alex's spine. They were not alone. The first step onto the bridge was an instinctual decision, born out of a need to keep moving forward. The air was thick, cold, and pressing on Alex's chest, but the silence was deafening. They took a slow, measured breath, the mist swirling around them like a wall, enveloping their entire being. Even the light had changed. What had been a greyish morning fog seemed to darken now, as if the world beyond the bridge was slowly swallowing them whole. Alex could barely make out the edges of the trees that lined the path, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The bridge itself felt like a forgotten relic, its wooden planks warped and uneven, creaking under the pressure of Alex's first cautious step. The weight of the air pressed down on Alex's shoulders, but they pushed through it. The fog parted slightly, offering just enough vision to make out the silhouette of the bridge stretching ahead, but it did little to lessen the feeling of being utterly alone. Every step forward felt like a step further into the unknown, into a world that no longer felt quite real. Alex's footsteps were the only sound, an almost unnatural noise in a place so devoid of life. With each step, Alex felt the tension building, as if the bridge itself was alive, shifting beneath their feet, breathing with them. The wooden planks creaked louder with each step, groaning as though the weight of time had taken its toll on the structure. It wasn't a normal sound. The sound was almost as if the bridge itself was trying to communicate something, though Alex couldn't decipher its meaning. The second step was a little firmer. The floor of the bridge was solid beneath their boots, though something was wrong. The air felt thicker. It clung to their skin, dragging against the fabric of their jacket. But it wasn't just the fog. It was as though the very air was saturated with something unseen, something barely perceptible, but there nonetheless. Just a bridge, Alex muttered under their breath, trying to reassure themselves. The words sounded hollow in the thick silence. But as they continued, the bridge began to feel too quiet. The world around them had been deathly still from the moment they'd set foot on the bridge, but now, the absolute absence of sound seemed oppressive, even suffocating. Alex's breath came out in little puffs, vanishing into the air as quickly as it formed. But still, there were no sounds of wildlife, no distant chirping of birds, no rustling leaves. Nothing. The silence hung like a thick shroud over everything, stifling any notion of life. It was then that Alex noticed something strange. The bridge seemed longer than it should have been. The beginning of it had been clearly visible from the road, but now, as Alex moved further into the mist, the end of the bridge seemed to recede further and further from view. It wasn't as though the bridge was stretching. No, it was simply that the distance between them and the far side of the bridge had become disorienting. What had once been a short stretch of planks was now an endless expanse of misty wood that led into oblivion. Alex stopped, their breath caught in their throat. The fog had thickened again, swirling around their feet, pooling in the hollow of the bridge, making the whole structure feel like it was floating in some kind of void. Panic rose like bile in their stomach, but they held it down, pushing the feeling aside. They took another step, but the moment their foot hit the next plank, the world seemed to shift again. The bridge groaned beneath them, a strange, hollow echo resounding through the wood. Alex froze. It was too loud, too deep, like the bridge itself was responding to their presence. Or perhaps, even aware of them. A small breeze picked up, but it was unnatural, unnerving. The mist stirred slightly, almost like a living thing, curling around Alex's legs as they continued forward. The temperature had dropped further, and now, Alex's breath wasn't the only thing visible in the mist. The moisture in the air seemed to condense into tiny droplets that clung to their skin, making them shiver involuntarily. Alex's steps slowed. Something wasn't right. The bridge hadn't seemed this imposing when they'd first approached it, but now, each step felt heavier, each creak of the wood more ominous. The fog swallowed everything around them. In the distance, the bridge stretched out endlessly, an unbroken path disappearing into the greyish void. There was no end in sight. It should have been impossible, but it was happening. The world around Alex felt wrong. The bridge seemed to be bending and twisting in ways that weren't physically possible. Each plank they stepped on felt like it had shifted since the last time they looked. And the more they focused on the details, the more they noticed things that shouldn't have been there, things hidden just beneath the surface of their perception. A figure appeared in the mist. At first, Alex thought it was their imagination playing tricks. Maybe it was the fog, distorting their senses. But no, there it was again. A figure, barely perceptible, standing off to the side of the bridge, hidden partially by the mist. At first, it was a blur, no more than a shadow in the distance, but as Alex blinked, it seemed to sharpen into focus. A tall, hunched silhouette, standing motionless in the fog. Alex's heart skipped a beat. "Hello," they called out, their voice trembling slightly despite their best efforts to sound confident. No response. The figure stood there, unmoving, its features still indistinct in the fog. Alex's eyes narrowed. They took a step forward, trying to close the distance, but the figure didn't budge. Instead, the mist between them seemed to thicken, obscuring the figure even more. They tried again, but the closer they got, the more the figure seemed to fade, retreating further into the fog as if it were being swallowed up by it. With each step, the figure grew more distant. Then, just as Alex was about to turn back in frustration, the figure vanished completely. Alex paused, their chest tightening. There was no way they could have missed it. They had seen something, or someone out there. But now, the bridge felt even emptier than before. The strange figure was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that hung thick in the air. Alex took another step forward, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching them, something that had been there all along. Their footfall echoed hollowly through the fog. The bridge seemed to stretch out forever, the wooden planks creaking under their weight. But the strange sensation of being observed was growing stronger. Suddenly, a noise broke through the silence, distant, but unmistakable. A faint, dragging sound. A heavy scrape, like metal on wood, echoing from somewhere ahead. It was a sound that sent a shiver up Alex's spine. Frozen, Alex listened intently. The sound came again, closer this time. It was unmistakable now. Someone, or something, was dragging something heavy across the bridge. The mist thickened again, and in the distance, Alex thought they could make out another figure, this time moving slowly, deliberately, dragging something across the wooden planks. Alex's breath quickened, panic rising like bile in their throat. They turned sharply, but when they looked back, the figure was gone. The bridge was empty. The dragging sound stopped. Silence returned, but the feeling of being watched, of being judged, was more intense than ever. Alex's heart pounded in their chest as they took another step forward, the strange dragging sound still fresh in their mind. The bridge seemed to stretch on endlessly, the mist swirling around them with increasing intensity, making it harder and harder to see. But the fog wasn't the only thing that had thickened. The air, once cold and uninviting, had turned heavier, almost oppressive. Every breath felt like it had to be pulled in through an unseen weight, and the faint taste of iron lingered in the back of Alex's throat. With each step, the atmosphere around them seemed to close in, as though the bridge was slowly drawing them deeper into its clutches, like a trap tightening around its prey. The wooden planks beneath their feet creaked, but now, the sound had changed. It was no longer the harmless groan of an old structure. It was a low, guttural rumble, as if the bridge itself were sighing, like it was alive. Alex paused again, lifting their foot to listen. The noise had stopped for a moment, but there was no mistaking the change in the air. The feeling of the bridge shifting, warping, was undeniable now. There was something wrong. They hadn't been on the bridge for long, maybe 15 minutes at most, but already it felt as though time itself had started to twist. The beginning of the bridge, the point where they had first stepped onto it, seemed so far away now. But the distance wasn't the only thing that had changed. The planks beneath them were no longer aligned. The spacing between them had widened, creating jagged gaps that didn't exist before. Alex's foot nearly slipped into one of the cracks. It was as if the bridge was purposefully trying to trip them, to make them stumble, to slow them down. And then, just as quickly, the gaps closed again, the planks realigning themselves as if nothing had ever been wrong. Alex took a cautious step forward, trying to keep their balance. The mist seemed to thicken again, swirling around their legs as if something was moving within it. They glanced over their shoulder, but there was nothing. The fog was an unbroken veil, and behind them, the path had vanished. There was no turning back now, no retreat. Another step. The bridge groaned under their weight. But this time, the sound was accompanied by something else, a whisper. It was faint, so faint that Alex wasn't sure if it had come from their own mind or if it had really come from the bridge itself. But it was there, crawling through the air around them. "Turn back." Alex froze, the whisper trailing off into the void of the mist. Their pulse quickened. It hadn't been their voice. There was no one else on the bridge. They were alone. Or, so they thought. They took another step, this time more carefully. The sound of their boots on the planks was muffled, as if the bridge was absorbing the noise. And then came the next strange thing. The bridge began to feel wrong underfoot. The wood had always been uneven, but now it felt as though something beneath the surface had shifted. The planks no longer gave the usual reassuring creak. Instead, they felt soft, spongy, almost like they were sinking into the ground with every step. Alex paused and crouched down, running their fingers along the edges of the bridge. The wood was slick to the touch, as if it had been oiled or coated with something unnatural. A chill shot up their spine as they realized that the surface of the bridge wasn't just old, it was decaying. The boards that had seemed sturdy and reliable now felt as though they were rotting from within. Suddenly, the bridge groaned louder than before, shaking slightly beneath Alex's feet, the vibration running through their legs. They stood up quickly, wiping their hands on their pants as if they could rid themselves of the creeping unease that had settled over them. The mist, which had clung to the edges of the bridge, seemed to grow thicker with every passing second, the air becoming dense with an unknown force. It wasn't natural. It was as though the fog itself was breathing, moving in slow, deliberate patterns as it inched toward Alex's face, curling into their lungs, making them cough. And then, they saw it. A shadow. At first, it was small, barely more than a flicker in the corner of their eye. But as they turned their head to focus on it, the shadow grew slowly, surely, taking form in the mist ahead of them. It was a figure, tall and indistinct, yet somehow familiar. Its form swayed in the fog like a puppet on strings, too fluid, too unnatural to be real. Alex's breath caught in their throat. They had seen something like it before, back at the beginning, when they had first stepped onto the bridge. But now, it wasn't a distant figure. It was moving toward them, slowly but surely. The soft scrape of its feet on the wood sent chills down Alex's spine. "Hello," Alex called out, their voice a little shakier than they intended. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it seemed to sway closer, its shape growing more distinct. It was wearing something black, long and flowing, though the details of its face were hidden, obscured by the fog. As it drew nearer, Alex's pulse raced, their feet frozen in place as if something invisible was holding them in place. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Not a step back, not a retreat. It just blinked out of existence, dissolving into the fog as though it had never been there at all. Alex stood there, eyes wide, mouth dry. Their mind raced, trying to make sense of what they had just seen. But before they could process it fully, the sound of the bridge shifting beneath their feet pulled their attention back to the task at hand. The bridge was no longer stable. It felt as though the ground itself was moving, shifting, undulating beneath them. The planks were warping, twisting, bending in ways that weren't possible for something so rigid. Alex glanced down. The wood beneath them had transformed, changing into something dark and glistening, as though covered in some sort of fluid. It wasn't just decay, this was alive, something pulsing, something moving just beneath the surface. Alex stumbled back, only to find that the ground behind them had changed as well. Where the bridge had been solid before, the wood now curled into itself, like the roots of some great, ancient tree. The bridge was no longer a simple structure, it was becoming something else entirely, a living entity that was slowly pulling them into its grasp. A low hum echoed through the bridge, vibrating through the planks and into Alex's bones. It wasn't a sound, per se, but more of a sensation, a frequency that seemed to reverberate from the very core of the bridge. Alex's head throbbed with the sensation, their ears ringing as the hum grew louder, more insistent. "Get off the bridge." The voice came again, louder this time. It was more than a whisper. It was a command. Alex didn't know where it came from, but they could feel it in their chest. Something was warning them. Something was telling them to leave, to turn back before it was too late. But there was no turning back now. The bridge had changed, and with it, everything. It wasn't just the wood or the mist, it was the very air around them, the very fabric of the place. They had stepped into something ancient, something that had been waiting for them. Something that wasn't just a bridge, but a doorway to something else. Something that was closing in. Alex's breath was ragged, heart hammering in their chest, as they fought to steady themselves on the bridge. The mist had thickened into an almost tangible force, wrapping around their body, choking the very air they breathed. The ominous hum that had once been subtle now thrummed loudly, vibrating through the very planks of the bridge, sending waves of unease through their body. Each step forward felt like it could be their last. The planks beneath their feet groaned with a deep, hollow sound, as if the bridge itself was warning them. The air, thick and suffocating, seemed to wrap itself around Alex, making each breath a battle. Sweat trickled down their forehead, mixing with the dampness in the air, but it wasn't the cold that was causing the shiver in their spine. No, it was the weight of the shadows around them, closing in. "Turn back," the voice whispered again, louder now, clearer, though no one stood nearby. Alex's pulse skipped, the hairs on the back of their neck standing on end. It wasn't the voice of a person, it was the voice of the bridge itself, a deep, low hum that vibrated against their chest, like it was coming from deep within the very structure of the bridge. Alex stopped, paralyzed with fear, staring into the dense fog ahead. Something was coming. From within the mist, the shadow reappeared. But this time, it wasn't just an outline, a flickering form. No. It was more solid now, its figure clearer as it took a few deliberate steps forward. A figure dressed in flowing black, its face hidden by the mist, but the shape, the aura, it was unmistakable. The same shadow that had vanished before was back, and this time, it wasn't retreating. The ground beneath Alex's feet seemed to tremble, as if the bridge was alive, and it was waking up. A low, guttural growl echoed from the depths of the bridge, the sound resonating deep in Alex's bones. The wood underfoot shifted violently, warping and bending, as though the bridge itself was breathing, alive, aware of their presence. The sensation was terrifying, a living entity, ancient and unfathomable, turning against them. "Leave now," the voice hissed, sharper this time, almost pleading, yet threatening. Alex couldn't look away from the figure ahead of them. It wasn't moving as a person would. No, it was gliding, a slow, deliberate drift through the mist. The closer it came, the more Alex could feel its presence, its coldness, seeping into their skin. It was overwhelming, like standing at the edge of an abyss, knowing there was no escape from what waited beyond. Their feet dragged with increasing difficulty, as if something was holding them back, pulling them into the depths of the bridge. But Alex could no longer turn back, not when the mist had swallowed the path behind them. And the shadow, it was nearly upon them now. "Who are you?" Alex finally managed to choke out, their voice hoarse from the thick air. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out with an almost unnatural slowness, its hand extending toward Alex, fingers long and skeletal, like an invitation to the void. As the fingers neared, a deep, unnatural cold radiated from them, an icy chill that stung their skin like the touch of death itself. Alex stumbled backward, their legs trembling with fear, as the temperature around them dropped, their breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The shadow's hand remained extended, and Alex felt an irresistible force pulling them closer, a magnetic pull that felt like it was coming from the very core of the bridge. "No," Alex gasped, their chest tight with panic. They fought to steady themselves, but the ground beneath them swayed, shifting like the bridge itself had become a vast ocean. They couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. The voice in their mind was deafening now. "Leave. Go. Don't look back." But it was too late for that. There was no leaving now. With one final, desperate lunge, Alex reached forward, grabbed the nearest support beam, and pulled themselves upright. The cold hand from the shadow was nearly upon them now, and the grip that had once been a gentle invitation turned into something far more malevolent, an unyielding, grasping force. They had only moments left. No. Alex screamed into the mist, their voice hoarse, raw. Let me go. But the figure didn't stop, didn't slow. Instead, the mist swirled more violently around them, as if the fog itself had become part of the shadow. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Alex was caught in the grip of something ancient, something powerful, that wasn't of this world. It was the bridge, yes, but more than that. It was the heart of the place, the very soul of the bridge that had called to them. Suddenly, the ground beneath Alex buckled. With a sickening lurch, the bridge twisted and shuddered violently, sending Alex tumbling forward into the mist. Their body collided with the ground hard, the breath knocked out of them. But the shadow wasn't finished. The mist, once thick and opaque, cleared for just a moment, and in that space, Alex saw the face of the figure that had stalked them from the beginning. It was not human. It was a woman, yes, but her face was twisted in a grotesque, inhuman way. The skin stretched taut, translucent in places, revealing dark veins beneath. Her eyes glowed faintly, like two orbs of pure blackness, sucking in every bit of light. Her hair, long and disheveled, billowed around her like a cloud of dark smoke. And her mouth twisted into a smile that seemed to consume the very air. "Welcome," she said softly, the words dripping with malice. "To my bridge." Before Alex could react, the ground beneath them cracked open, and the wooden planks gave way. The bridge had fractured into an impossible chasm. The bridge was no longer a simple structure, they were at the mercy of the darkness, the mist, the bridge itself. They fell. For what felt like an eternity, Alex plummeted, the air rushing past their ears in a deafening roar. The world spun, a blur of mist and shadow. There was no escape from the fall, no way to stop it. The darkness swallowed them whole. Then, just as abruptly as the fall had begun, it stopped. A sharp, sudden jerk of gravity threw them against something solid. Alex gasped, their lungs burning with the lack of air, their body aching as though it had been battered and broken. They opened their eyes, blinking through the mist, trying to understand what had just happened. They were no longer on the bridge. The mist had parted, and now Alex found themselves standing in a place that didn't make sense, a place that wasn't the bridge. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, the ground slick beneath their feet. A vast, impossible chasm stretched out before them, the bridge now a distant memory in the fog. But the figure was still there. And now, there was no mistaking it. The shadow was no longer just a figure. It was something real, something more. And it had come for Alex. "Now you understand," the woman's voice echoed, but it was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, reverberating through the chasm. "You cannot leave. This is where you belong." And with that, the darkness began to close in again, pulling Alex toward it, deeper into the abyss. The darkness had enveloped Alex entirely. The sense of hopelessness was absolute now. The bridge was gone, vanished into the dense fog, leaving nothing but a void, an endless chasm that stretched before them like the maw of some dark, forgotten beast. Time had no meaning here. The weight of fear, of isolation, pressed in from all sides, suffocating, unbearable. Every breath felt like a battle, and with each gasping inhale, Alex could feel themselves sinking deeper into the abyss. The woman, the shadow, stood in front of them now, her form flickering in and out of the mist, as if she were part of the very air around them. Her eyes glowed with an eerie light, two hollow orbs that seemed to pierce through the fog and into Alex's soul. There was no escaping her now. No more running. The decision was here. A low, guttural laugh escaped from her lips, sending a shiver through Alex's entire body. "You can't escape, you know," she said, her voice a cold, mocking whisper that seemed to come from every direction at once. "This place, this bridge, it has claimed so many before you. And it will claim you too." Alex's heart raced in their chest as their mind scrambled for a way out. They had been running for what felt like hours, no, days. But now, standing at the edge of this chasm, there was no more room to run. The fog pressed in around them, so thick and oppressive, It felt like the very air was alive, suffocating them with its presence. A sharp pain surged through Alex's chest as their lungs struggled for air. The sense of drowning was overwhelming. Each breath felt as if they were inhaling poison, and their head began to spin. They wanted to scream, to fight, but something deeper inside them held them still. It was as if the very essence of the bridge had wrapped itself around their body, constricting every movement, every thought. "You think you can fight it?" The shadow's voice grew louder, more insistent. "You think you can escape the judgment of this place? You are wrong. You are here now. And here you will stay." A flicker of doubt crossed Alex's mind, a terrifying thought that seemed to curl itself around their spine like a serpent. What if the shadow was right? What if there was no escape? What if the bridge, this cursed place, was their fate now? No one would come for them. No one would ever find them. They would be lost to time, swallowed by the bridge and the mist forever. The terror was almost unbearable. Alex's body trembled, their knees buckling beneath them as the weight of the choice they were facing grew heavier. But they couldn't give in. They couldn't allow this place to claim them as it had so many before. The shadow stepped closer, her cold presence pressing against them. Her hand, now skeletal and withering, reached out once more, its bony fingers brushing against Alex's skin like ice. The touch sent a jolt of pure fear straight to their heart. "You know what must be done," the shadow whispered, her voice a soft caress. "You can stay here, with me, in eternal company, where you will never feel alone. You will never be forgotten. You will be part of the bridge, part of me." Alex recoiled, their stomach turning. The thought of being trapped here, forever a prisoner to this dark, oppressive force, was too much to bear. But what choice did they have? The more they thought about it, the more they could feel the pull, the urge to surrender, to give in to the darkness. Yet, deep inside, something flickered, a small, stubborn flame of defiance that refused to be extinguished. Alex couldn't let the shadow win. They had to fight, even if it meant facing their greatest fear, making the decision to escape or to remain. The answer was clear, they had to choose. With every ounce of strength they had left, Alex pushed back against the shadow's touch, staggering back and finding their footing once more. The ground beneath them shifted, the chasm seeming to pull at their very being, but Alex stood tall, their resolve hardening. "No," they whispered through clenched teeth. "I will not become one with this place. I will not let you take me." The shadow paused, her glowing eyes narrowing, her smile widening, revealing teeth that were more like the jagged edges of shattered glass. "You think you can defy me?" she hissed, her voice rising in anger. "You think you can resist what is inevitable? The bridge will claim you, one way or another." Alex's heart pounded in their chest, but they held their ground, their gaze locked with the shadow. They knew they couldn't win by force alone. They didn't have the strength to fight her directly. But they had something else, knowledge. As the mist swirled around them, Alex's mind began to clear. The fog, the sensation of drowning, the presence of the shadow, it was all part of the bridge's influence. The bridge wasn't just a place, it was alive. And it fed on fear. They had to stop being afraid. Alex took a deep breath, forcing the fear down. They focused on the feeling, the oppressive weight of the fog, the suffocating presence of the shadow. The more they resisted, the more the shadow pressed against them, the more they could feel the bridge's power tightening around their body, trying to pull them back into its depths. But Alex wouldn't let it. They had one choice left, one chance to escape before it was too late. "Enough," Alex said, their voice stronger now. "You will not win." As the words left their mouth, something inside them shifted, a surge of energy that seemed to flow through their veins, pushing back against the darkness. The mist seemed to recoil, the shadow's figure faltering as Alex focused every ounce of their willpower into resisting the pull. The shadow shrieked, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air itself, but Alex didn't flinch. Instead, they stepped forward, their body moving with a newfound sense of purpose, of strength. "I choose to leave," Alex declared, their voice louder, fiercer than before. "I choose to survive." The chasm seemed to tremble, and for a moment, the darkness lifted. The bridge, the mist, the shadow, all of it began to fade, retreating into the distance, as if the very essence of the place was unraveling at Alex's defiance. But the choice wasn't as simple as just walking away. The bridge had one final test for Alex, one final choice that would decide their fate. Ahead of them, the ground split open, revealing a yawning abyss that stretched far below. A thin, fragile plank of wood, barely visible in the mist, hung across the chasm, the way out. But the moment Alex stepped forward, the shadow appeared again, more powerful than before. "Choose," she demanded, her voice a twisted echo. "You can stay with me, with us. Or you can walk across the bridge, but the cost will be your soul." Alex's legs trembled, their body weak from the strain of the encounter. The decision seemed impossible. How could they trust that the bridge would let them go? How could they believe that walking across that final plank wouldn't seal their fate forever? But Alex knew one thing: they couldn't stay here. They couldn't become part of the bridge. Taking one last look at the shadow, Alex stepped forward, their heart racing. They placed one foot on the plank, and then another. The bridge groaned beneath their feet, but it held. The mist began to dissipate, the oppressive weight lifting, as Alex made their way across the plank. With every step, they felt themselves pulling away from the bridge's grasp, away from the nightmare they had been trapped in for so long. They weren't free yet, but with each step, they were closer. And when Alex finally reached the other side, they knew they had chosen life.